The first time Clara Whitfield looked at me across that porch table, she reached for my hand in front of her dying mother and said the words that would change my life forever, "Just for tonight, will you pretend to be my husband?" I did not know that woman, had never met her before that afternoon, and yet something in her trembling voice made me say yes before I even understood what I was agreeing to. If you believe in kindness, in forgiveness, in the quiet miracles that happen when strangers choose to trust each other, I want you to like this video, leave a comment about a time someone showed you unexpected grace, share this with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel, because our community grows stronger every time someone new joins us searching for stories like this one. My name is Thomas Reyes, and before that Saturday afternoon in early September, my life had settled into something quiet and unremarkable. I worked at a hardware store in a small town called Millbrook, the kind of place where the same customers came in every week and everyone knew your name, your father's name, and usually your grandfather's name too. I was 34 years old, divorced for 3 years, and had mostly made peace with the idea that my life would continue on this steady, uneventful path. I had a small apartment above the old bakery on Main Street, a used truck that ran well enough, and a habit of eating lunch alone on the bench outside the store, watching the town move around me like a river I had stepped out of. That particular Saturday, I had gone to the farmer's market near the edge of town, the one that's set up every weekend in the gravel lot beside the community center. I was looking for tomatoes, nothing more, when a young woman nearly collided with me as she rushed between stalls, her arms full of grocery bags, her eyes red and swollen from crying. She apologized quickly, tried to move past me, but one of her bags split at the bottom and oranges rolled across the gravel in every direction. I knelt down without thinking and began gathering them up, and when I looked up at her face, I saw something in her expression that I would never forget. It was not embarrassment over the spilled bag. It was the look of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had simply run out of strength to hold it together any longer. She thanked me, took the oranges back, and turned to leave, but then she stopped and turned around again. She asked if I had somewhere to be that afternoon, and when I told her I did not, she asked me the question that would upend everything I thought I understood about my life. Her mother, she explained, was dying. Not suddenly, not tragically in the way strangers imagine when they hear those words, but slowly, over the course of many months, from an illness that had stolen her strength piece by piece until she now spent most of her days in a chair by the window, watching the world she could no longer fully participate in. Her mother's one remaining wish, she said, the thing she talked about more than anything else in her final weeks, was to see her daughter married and settled before she passed. Clara had been engaged once, years ago, to a man named Preston who had left her 2 weeks before their wedding, and since then she had told her mother very little about her personal life, mostly because there was nothing to tell. But 3 months ago, in a moment of desperation, wanting to give her mother some final peace, Clara had told a small lie. She had said she was seeing someone. She had said his name was Thomas, because that was the name of a boy she had loved briefly in high school, and it was the only lie that had felt safe enough to speak out loud. Her mother's health had declined faster than anyone expected, and now, this very evening, her mother's sister and cousins were coming for what everyone quietly understood might be one of the last family dinners they would all share together. Her mother had been asking for weeks to finally meet this Thomas. Clara had run out of excuses, run out of time, and run out of the strength to keep lying to a woman who deserved nothing but truth and comfort in her final days. I stood there in the gravel lot holding a bag of oranges, listening to a stranger's confession, and I understood in that moment that she was not asking me for anything small. She was asking me to walk into a family's private grief, to sit at a table with people I had never met, and to become, for a few hours, a man who did not exist, so that a dying woman could believe her daughter was not alone in the world. I should have said no. Any reasonable person would have said no. But there was something about the rawness in Clara's voice, the way her hands shook as she spoke, that reminded me of my own mother's final months, of how desperately I had wanted to give her peace before she left this world, and how helpless I had felt when I could not always provide it. I told Clara yes. I told her I would come to dinner and be whoever she needed me to be for one evening, and in exchange I asked for nothing except that she tell me enough about her family that I would not embarrass her at the table. We sat together on a bench outside the community center for nearly an hour while she filled in the details of a life I was about to borrow. Her mother's name was Margaret Whitfield, a former schoolteacher who had spent 30 years shaping the minds of children in Millbrook's only elementary school before retiring to tend her garden and, later, to fight the illness that had settled into her lungs and would not let go. Clara's father had passed away when she was 19, and since then it had been just the two of them, mother and daughter, leaning on each other through every hardship life had thrown their way. Clara worked as a nurse at the regional hospital, which explained the exhaustion etched into her face, the way grief and duty had folded together into something that looked like permanent weariness. Her Aunt Beatrice, her mother's younger sister, would be at dinner along with Beatrice's husband Corbin and their adult son Desmond, a man Clara described with a tired roll of her eyes as someone who had never missed an opportunity to make her feel small since they were children. I asked her what story we would tell about how we met, and she said simply that we had met at the hospital, that I had come in after a minor accident and she had been my nurse, and that our relationship had developed slowly over the following months. It was believable enough, close enough to something that could have happened, and I found myself memorizing the details the way a student memorizes facts before an exam, terrified of failing a test that mattered more than any I had taken before. The Whitfield house sat at the end of a quiet street lined with maple trees just beginning to show the first hints of autumn color, a modest two-story home with a wraparound porch and a garden that, even in its slightly overgrown state, showed the careful hand of someone who had once tended it with love. Clara met me at my truck before I could even knock, her expression tight with nerves, and she reminded me one final time of the story we had agreed upon before taking my hand and leading me up the porch steps. The moment the front door opened and I saw Margaret Whitfield sitting in a wheelchair in the front hallway, thin and pale but with eyes that burned with a fierce, undimmed intelligence, I felt the full weight of what I had agreed to do settle into my chest. This was not a game. This was not a harmless favor between strangers. This was a woman staring death in the face, holding on to one last hope, and I was about to become the answer to her prayers, even if only for a few hours. Margaret's face transformed the moment she saw me, and she reached out both of her thin hands toward Clara, tears immediately welling in her eyes. "I knew she'd find you," she said, her voice cracking with an emotion so pure and so overwhelming that I felt my own throat tighten in response. "I told her, Thomas, I told her that the right man would come along when she stopped looking so hard, and here you are." She took my hand in both of hers, and her grip, weak as it was, held a kind of desperate strength, the strength of someone gathering every last bit of joy they could hold before their body failed them completely. I knelt down beside her wheelchair, and I told her it was wonderful to finally meet her, and I meant every word, even though everything else about who I claimed to be was a fabrication built in less than an hour on a bench outside a farmer's market. The dinner that followed was unlike anything I had ever experienced. Aunt Beatrice arrived 20 minutes later with her husband Corbin, a quiet man who mostly nodded along with whatever his wife said, and their son Desmond, a broad-shouldered man in his late 30s with an expensive watch and a habit of checking his phone every few minutes as though something more important than his dying aunt might be happening elsewhere. Beatrice studied me with open suspicion from the moment I walked into the dining room, the kind of scrutiny that made it clear she had heard about this mysterious Thomas before and had her doubts about his existence. She asked pointed questions throughout the meal, about where I worked, about my family, about how exactly Clara and I had met, and I answered each one as carefully as I could, drawing on the details Clara had given me and improvising the rest with a steadiness that surprised even myself. Desmond seemed less interested in me than in reminding everyone at the table, in subtle and not so subtle ways, of his own success, mentioning his recent promotion, his new car, the vacation home he and his wife had just purchased, until even his own father seemed to wince at the constant self-congratulation. But it was Margaret who held the room, despite her frailty, despite the oxygen tube resting beneath her nose and the way her hands trembled slightly whenever she lifted her water glass. She asked me questions too, but hers were different from Beatrice's interrogations. She wanted to know if I made her daughter laugh, if I understood how hard Clara worked at the hospital, if I would be patient with her when she came home exhausted after difficult shifts. She wanted to know if I saw the same strength in her daughter that she had spent her whole life trying to nurture. Each question felt less like a test of my fabricated relationship and more like a mother passing down a torch, and trusting the care of her most precious creation to whoever would listen closely enough to understand its weight. I found myself answering not with rehearsed lies but with genuine observations I had already begun forming about Clara in the short hours I had known her, the exhaustion in her eyes that spoke of long shifts spent caring for strangers, the fierce protectiveness in her voice when she spoke of her mother, the quiet dignity with which she had approached me that afternoon, ready to beg a stranger for help rather than let her mother's final wish go unfulfilled. Halfway through dinner, Margaret asked Clara to help her to the bathroom, and in the few minutes they were away from the table, Beatrice leaned across toward me with narrowed eyes and asked me directly if I was truly serious about her niece or if this was some kind of temporary arrangement Clara had cooked up to ease her mother's mind. The question hit closer to the truth than Beatrice could have known, and for a moment I did not know how to answer. I looked at Corbin, who suddenly seemed very interested in his plate, and at Desmond, who had finally put his phone away and was watching me with something between curiosity and amusement, clearly enjoying the discomfort radiating off me. I told Beatrice, as steadily as I could manage, that I understood how much Margaret's happiness meant to Clara, and that I intended to be exactly the kind of man Margaret hoped I would be. It was not quite a lie and not quite the truth, but it seemed to satisfy Beatrice enough that she sat back in her chair, though her eyes remained watchful for the rest of the meal. When Clara and Margaret returned to the table, the conversation shifted to old memories, to stories about Clara's childhood, about the garden Margaret had once tended with such devotion, about the husband and father whose absence still lingered in every corner of the house like a familiar scent that never quite faded. Margaret spoke of her late husband with such tenderness that I found myself moved nearly to tears, listening to a woman describe a love that had shaped the entire architecture of her life, a love she clearly hoped her daughter would find as well before it was too late for her to witness it. As the afternoon light began to soften and slant through the dining room windows, painting everything in shades of amber and gold, Margaret reached across the table and took both my hand and Clara's hand in hers, and she told us, in a voice thick with emotion, that seeing us together had given her a peace she had not felt in months. She said she could finally let go of the worry that had kept her awake so many nights, the fear that Clara would spend her life alone, giving everything to others at the hospital and having nothing left for herself. She said that watching the way I looked at her daughter, she knew, without any doubt, that Clara had finally found someone who would take care of her the way she deserved to be taken care of. I sat there, holding the hand of a dying woman who believed I was her son-in-law, and I felt something crack open inside my chest, something that had been closed off since my divorce, since the slow erosion of a marriage that had ended not in dramatic betrayal but in the quiet exhaustion of two people who had simply stopped trying to understand each other. I looked at Clara across the table, saw the tears she was fighting to hold back, saw the gratitude and the guilt warring in her expression, and I understood that we were both, in that moment, giving Margaret something neither of us fully possessed ourselves, a picture of love and commitment built entirely out of borrowed pieces and desperate hope. After dinner, as Beatrice and her family said their goodbyes and Margaret retired to rest in the living room, Clara walked me out to my truck, and the moment we were alone on the porch, out of earshot of the house, she broke down completely. She apologized over and over, saying she never should have asked me to do something so dishonest, that she had spent the entire dinner terrified I would slip up, terrified her mother would somehow see through the lie and feel the sting of betrayal in her final months of life instead of the comfort Clara had hoped to give her. I told her that watching her with her mother, watching the way she had held Margaret's hand and laughed at old stories and gently corrected the details Margaret sometimes forgot, I understood that this had never been about deception at all. It had been about love, about a daughter trying desperately to give her dying mother one final gift before it was too late to give anything at all. I told her I did not regret coming, and that whatever happened next, I was glad I had been there for that evening. I expected that to be the end of it. I expected to drive back to my apartment above the bakery and let the strange, beautiful afternoon fade into memory, a story I might tell someone years later about the strangest favor I had ever agreed to do for a stranger. But Clara called me 2 days later, her voice tight with anxiety, explaining that her mother had asked to see me again, that Margaret's doctor had mentioned her condition seemed to be stabilizing slightly, perhaps buoyed by the emotional lift of finally believing her daughter was settled and cared for, and that Margaret wanted another dinner, another visit, another chance to sit with the man she believed would spend the rest of his life loving her daughter. Clara asked if I would be willing to come again, and this time there was no pretense that this would be a single, isolated favor. She was asking me to continue a lie that had no clear ending, a performance that would have to sustain itself for as long as Margaret remained alive, however long or short that might be. I said yes again, though this time the decision came with a heavier weight, because I understood now what I was truly agreeing to. I was not simply attending one dinner and disappearing back into my ordinary life. I was stepping into an ongoing role, becoming a fixture in a family's final months together, and the longer this continued, the more entangled my own heart would become in a story that had begun as nothing more than an act of kindness toward a stranger in a parking lot. Over the following weeks, I found myself at the Whitfield house more and more often, sometimes for dinner, sometimes simply to sit with Margaret in the afternoons while Clara worked long shifts at the hospital. Margaret and I developed an easy rapport that surprised us both. She told me stories about her years teaching third grade, about the students who had gone on to become doctors and teachers and, in one memorable case, the mayor of a neighboring town. She told me about her husband, a quiet carpenter named Walter who had built half the furniture in the house with his own hands before a heart attack had taken him too soon, leaving Margaret to raise Clara alone through her teenage years. She asked me about my own family, and I found myself telling her the truth, about my mother's death 5 years earlier, about my father who had moved to Arizona and rarely called, about my divorce and the quiet loneliness that had settled into my life afterward like dust in an empty room. It was during one of these afternoon conversations, weeks into this strange arrangement, that Margaret said something that struck me with unexpected force. She told me that grief, real grief, the kind that reshapes a person from the inside out, teaches you to recognize authenticity in others, because you no longer have the energy to waste on people who are not genuine. She said that from the very first moment she saw me on her porch, something in her had recognized a kindred sadness, a man who understood loss the way she did, and that this recognition was part of why she had trusted me so completely, so instantly, despite having only just met me. I sat there in her living room, sunlight streaming through the lace curtains, and I felt an overwhelming shame settle over me, because I knew that whatever authentic connection Margaret sensed between us, it existed alongside a fundamental lie about who I was to her daughter, a lie I had continued to sustain for weeks now, a lie that grew more difficult to bear with every conversation that deepened my genuine affection for this dying woman and her family. Clara and I, in the meantime, had developed our own complicated relationship, separate from the performance we maintained in front of Margaret. We spent hours together preparing for each visit, coordinating our stories, but somewhere in those preparation sessions, in the quiet moments between rehearsing lies, something real had begun to grow. I found myself looking forward to her phone calls, to the easy way our conversations drifted from planning our next visit to talking about our actual lives, her exhaustion at the hospital, my quiet days at the hardware store, the small joys and frustrations that made up the texture of ordinary existence. I began to understand that the woman I had met crying in a parking lot over spilled oranges was someone of remarkable strength and tenderness, someone who had spent years putting everyone else's needs before her own, first as a daughter caring for a widowed mother, then as a nurse caring for strangers in their most vulnerable moments, and now as a woman desperately trying to give her dying mother peace even at the cost of her own honesty. The complication that neither of us had anticipated arrived in early October, when Desmond, still smarting from whatever perceived slight he had felt at that first dinner, decided to investigate the mysterious Thomas his cousin had produced so suddenly. He was not a cruel man exactly, but he was competitive and insecure in ways that made him seek out weaknesses in others, and something about my sudden appearance in Clara's life had never sat right with him. He began asking around Millbrook, a small enough town that word traveled quickly, and it did not take him long to learn that Thomas Reyes worked at the hardware store, had been divorced for 3 years, and had, as far as anyone in town could recall, never once been seen with Clara Whitfield before that September afternoon. He also discovered, through a cousin who worked at the hospital, that no nurse named Clara Whitfield had ever treated a patient named Thomas Reyes for any accident, minor or otherwise, in the hospital's recent records. Desmond arrived at the Whitfield house on a Sunday afternoon in mid-October, while Clara and I were sitting with Margaret in the garden, helping her enjoy one of the last warm afternoons before autumn fully settled into the town. He walked directly up to us, and without any preamble, without any consideration for his aunt's fragile health, he announced loudly that he had discovered the truth, that Thomas and Clara's entire relationship was a fabrication, a story invented to give a dying woman false comfort. Margaret's face went pale, and for a moment, the garden fell into a silence so complete that I could hear the wind moving through the maple leaves above us. Clara stood frozen, her hand still resting on her mother's shoulder, and I watched years of careful lying collapse in the space of a single cruel announcement, watched the peace we had worked so hard to build shatter in front of the woman it had been meant to protect. Margaret's reaction, however, was not what any of us expected. She sat quietly for a long moment, her eyes moving between Clara's stricken face and my own, and then, to everyone's surprise, she began to laugh, a soft, weary laugh that carried more understanding than anger. She told Desmond that she had known, or at least suspected, almost from the beginning, that something about the story did not quite add up, that a mother's intuition was sharper than any of them gave her credit for. She said she had noticed the small inconsistencies, the way Clara sometimes hesitated before answering questions about our supposed history, the way I occasionally seemed to be learning about Clara's life in real time rather than recalling it from months of shared experience. But she said she had chosen not to press the matter, because whatever the truth of how Thomas had come into their lives, what she had witnessed over the following weeks was not a lie at all. She had watched me hold her daughter's hand with genuine tenderness. She had watched me listen to her own stories with real attention, not the polite half-listening of someone performing a role, but the focused presence of someone who actually cared. She said that whatever had begun as a fabrication had, in her careful observation, transformed into something entirely real, and that she had decided months ago that she would rather spend her remaining time believing in the goodness she saw in front of her than tearing it apart in search of a technical truth that mattered far less than the emotional one. Desmond, clearly having expected a very different reaction, stood there awkwardly, his moment of triumph deflating into confusion and, eventually, something like shame. Margaret turned to him with a gentleness that seemed to carry no trace of resentment, and she told him that she understood he had likely meant well, that perhaps some part of him had genuinely worried about his cousin being deceived or hurt, but that she needed him to understand something important before it was too late for her to say it. She told him that life was too short, that her own life in particular was too short now, to spend energy tearing down the fragile, hopeful things that people built for each other out of love. She told him that she had watched him for years compete and compare and diminish, that she loved him as her nephew and always would, but that she hoped, before her time ran out, he might learn to find his own peace instead of measuring himself against everyone around him. The garden fell silent again after she finished speaking, and I watched Desmond's face shift through several emotions before he finally nodded, mumbled an apology, and left without another word. Clara sank down into the chair beside her mother, tears streaming freely down her face now, and she began to apologize again, the same apology she had offered on the porch weeks earlier, but Margaret stopped her with a raised hand. She told Clara that there was nothing to apologize for, that a daughter's love, even when it took the shape of a small deception, was still love, still a gift freely given, and that she would treasure the weeks of peace it had bought her more than she could ever express. She looked at me then, and she asked, with a directness that caught me off guard, whether the affection I had shown her daughter over the past weeks had been part of the performance, or whether it had become something more. I looked at Clara, at her tear-streaked face, at the exhaustion and hope tangled together in her expression, and I understood that this was the moment the truth actually mattered, not the truth of how we had met, but the truth of what had grown between us since. I told Margaret, and Clara, and myself, that somewhere in the weeks of shared dinners and quiet afternoons and careful lies, I had fallen in love with her daughter, not because I had set out to, not because it had been part of any plan, but because Clara Whitfield was one of the most remarkable people I had ever met, and that the version of myself I had performed for Margaret's benefit had, at some point, simply become who I actually wanted to be for Clara. Margaret's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were tears of pure joy, and she reached for both of our hands the way she had that very first night, and she told us that she had known, she had simply known, from the moment she saw us together, that something real was growing between us, even if none of us had been ready to name it yet. The weeks that followed brought a different kind of honesty into the Whitfield household, one built not on careful rehearsal but on the genuine, evolving relationship between Clara and me. We no longer needed to coordinate stories or worry about slipping up in front of Beatrice's watchful eyes, because there was nothing left to hide. Margaret's health continued its slow, inevitable decline through October, her afternoons in the garden growing shorter, her voice growing quieter, but her spirit, if anything, seemed to grow brighter, buoyed by the knowledge that her daughter had found something real, something that would carry her forward long after Margaret herself was gone. I spent as much time as I could at the house, learning to cook the simple meals Margaret still enjoyed, learning the rhythms of Clara's exhausting hospital schedule so I could be present during the hours she needed support most, learning what it meant to love someone not through grand gestures but through the accumulated weight of showing up, day after day, in the ordinary moments that mattered more than anyone realized until they were running out of time to have them. If this story is touching something in you the way it touched me while I lived it, I want to ask you to pause for a moment and leave a comment about a lesson this story brought to your own heart, whether it is about the courage it takes to be honest, the healing power of forgiveness, or the way love can grow in the most unexpected circumstances, because these stories mean so much more when we share our own reflections in our community together. By the time November arrived, Margaret had grown too weak to leave her bed most days, and the family gathered around her with a quiet, aching tenderness that comes only in the final stretch of a long goodbye. Beatrice visited daily now, her earlier suspicion of me long forgotten, replaced by a gratitude she expressed in small ways, a squeeze of my hand, a plate of food pressed into my arms when I had forgotten to eat. Even Corbin, usually so quiet and reserved, began to open up during those weeks, sharing stories about Margaret and Walter from decades earlier, about the young couple who had once been the life of every gathering in Millbrook. Desmond returned too, humbled by the garden confrontation weeks earlier, and I watched him slowly transform from a man consumed by competition and comparison into someone capable of simply sitting beside his dying aunt, holding her hand, and listening to her stories without needing to insert his own achievements into the conversation. Margaret's words in the garden had planted something in him that autumn watered into a real, if painful, growth. Clara, throughout this final stretch, carried a grief so heavy I sometimes did not know how to help her bear it, except to be present, to hold her when she cried in the hospital parking lot after long shifts, to sit with her through the sleepless nights when fear of losing her mother kept her staring at the ceiling until dawn. I proposed to her during the second week of November, not with any elaborate plan or grand gesture, but simply because I could no longer imagine my life without her in it, and because I understood, with a clarity that surprised me, that whatever had begun as an act of kindness toward a stranger had become the truest, most important relationship of my life. I asked her one evening as we sat together on her mother's porch, the same porch where Margaret had first taken my hand and told her daughter she knew she would find me, and Clara said yes through tears that mixed grief and joy in equal measure, understanding, as I did, that we needed her mother to know this truth before time ran out entirely. We told Margaret the following morning, sitting together on the edge of her bed in the soft light of early autumn sun filtering through her bedroom curtains. Her strength had faded considerably by then, her voice reduced to a whisper, but when Clara told her mother that Thomas had proposed, that the love her mother had witnessed and believed in from that very first dinner had become permanent, real, unshakable, Margaret's face transformed with a joy so profound that it seemed, for a moment, to push back against the illness ravaging her body. She squeezed both of our hands with what remaining strength she had, and she told us that she could finally, truly let go, that she had spent her final months not in fear or sorrow but in the deep, abiding peace of knowing her daughter would not face the world alone. She asked if we might consider marrying soon, not out of any morbid urgency, she said with a weak smile, but because she wanted, more than anything else in this life, to witness the moment with her own eyes. We married 11 days later, in a small, hastily arranged ceremony in the Whitfield garden, the same garden where the truth had come tumbling out weeks earlier, the same garden where Margaret had spent so many hours of her life tending flowers with her late husband Walter. Beatrice organized the flowers, simple arrangements of late-blooming asters and chrysanthemums in warm autumn colors. Corbin built a small wooden arch, his hands remembering, perhaps, the same careful craftsmanship Walter had once brought to this very yard. Desmond, in an act that surprised everyone including himself, offered to walk Margaret down the makeshift aisle in her wheelchair, pushing her slowly across the grass so she could witness the ceremony from as close as possible, and I watched him do this with a tenderness that erased, at least for that afternoon, every trace of the competitive coldness that had once defined him. Margaret sat in the front row, wrapped in blankets despite the mild afternoon, an oxygen tank beside her wheelchair, her face luminous with a happiness that seemed to defy the frailty of her body. When Clara walked toward me across the grass in a simple ivory dress, her eyes never leaving mine, I felt the full weight of the journey that had brought us to this moment, from a stranger's desperate request in a parking lot to this quiet, sacred gathering of a family bound together by grief and love in equal measure. We exchanged vows that spoke not of grand romantic gestures but of the small, steady commitments that actually build a life together, promises to show up, to be honest, to choose each other again and again even on the hardest days. When the officiant pronounced us husband and wife, no longer in pretense but in absolute truth, Margaret wept openly, and Clara knelt beside her mother's wheelchair immediately after the ceremony, resting her forehead against Margaret's, both of them holding on to a joy too large for words. Margaret passed away 9 days after our wedding, in her own bed, surrounded by Clara, by Beatrice, by Corbin, and by me, holding her daughter's hand until her final breath left her body as gently as autumn leaves releasing from their branches. It was, everyone agreed afterward, the most peaceful death any of us had ever witnessed, a woman who had lived a full life of love and sacrifice, finally allowing herself to rest, secure in the knowledge that the daughter she had raised alone would not face the rest of her life without someone to hold her hand the way Margaret had once been held by Walter. We buried her beside her husband in the small cemetery at the edge of town, beneath a maple tree that would, every autumn from then on, turn the same brilliant amber and gold that had filled the dining room windows the evening I first met her. The months that followed our loss were not easy ones. Grief, as anyone who has walked through it knows, does not follow a predictable schedule, and there were days when Clara could barely rise from bed, when the absence of her mother's voice in the house felt like a physical wound that would never fully close. I learned during those months what it truly meant to show up for someone, not in the performed way I had once shown up for Margaret's benefit, but in the raw, unglamorous reality of grief, sitting with Clara through sleepless nights, learning to cook the meals her mother used to make so that some part of Margaret's presence remained in their home, slowly helping Clara sort through her mother's belongings when she finally found the strength to do so. Months later, discovering old photographs and letters that revealed a woman even more remarkable than the one we had come to know in her final weeks. We found, tucked inside an old cedar box in Margaret's closet, a letter she had written to Clara sometime before her health declined too severely, a letter she had apparently intended to give her daughter but never found the right moment to deliver. In it, Margaret wrote about her own fears for Clara's future, about the guilt she carried for how deeply Clara had thrown herself into caring for others, first for Margaret through the long years of her illness, then for strangers at the hospital, always giving so much of herself that Margaret worried nothing would remain for Clara's own happiness. She wrote about her hope that Clara would someday find someone who would care for her with the same devotion she had shown everyone else, someone who would remind her that she deserved rest, deserved joy, deserved a love that asked nothing of her except to simply exist and be cherished. Reading that letter together, Clara and I both understood, with an ache that mixed grief and gratitude, that Margaret's final months, however they had begun, had given her exactly the peace she had been hoping for all along, even if the path to that peace had wound through an unexpected lie that transformed, through the strange alchemy of genuine connection, into the very truth she had prayed for. In the year that followed, Clara and I settled into the rhythms of an ordinary married life, the kind that Margaret had so desperately hoped her daughter would someday have. We moved into the Whitfield house, unable to bear the thought of selling the place that held so many memories, and I found myself, in quiet moments, tending the garden Margaret had once loved so much, planting new flowers alongside the perennials she had established years earlier, feeling her presence in every bloom that returned each spring. Clara continued her work at the hospital, though she began, gradually, to build boundaries she had never allowed herself before, learning to say no to extra shifts, learning to prioritize her own rest and joy the way her mother had written about in that letter, learning that caring for herself was not selfishness but a necessary foundation for the caregiving that had always defined her generous spirit. Desmond, surprisingly, became one of our closest family members in the months after Margaret's passing, the transformation that had begun in that garden confrontation continuing to deepen as he processed his own grief and, alongside it, a genuine reckoning with the person he wanted to become. He visited often, helped with repairs around the house, and slowly revealed a warmth and vulnerability he had spent years hiding behind competition and bravado. Beatrice and Corbin remained close as well, their earlier suspicion of me transformed entirely into the easy affection of true family, and I found myself, a man who had once eaten lunch alone on a bench outside a hardware store, suddenly surrounded by a family larger and warmer than any I had known since my own mother's death years earlier. I think often about that afternoon in the farmer's market parking lot, about the oranges scattered across the gravel, about the desperate hope in Clara's eyes as she asked a complete stranger to become, however briefly, the answer to her mother's final wish. I think about how easily I could have said no, how reasonable it would have been to walk away from a request so strange and so fraught with complication. But I think, too, about everything that request gave me in return, a family, a wife whose strength and tenderness I admire more with each passing year, and the profound, unexpected gift of Margaret's love, a woman who saw through our fragile deception within weeks but chose, out of a wisdom born from her own losses, to nurture the real thing growing beneath it rather than destroy it in pursuit of a truth that mattered far less than the love actually taking root in front of her. Margaret Whitfield taught me, in the brief months I knew her, that sometimes the stories we tell to protect the people we love, however imperfect and however built on necessary fictions, can become the very foundation upon which real, lasting truth is built. She taught me that forgiveness is not about ignoring what is false but about recognizing what is genuine beneath it, and choosing to nurture that instead. She taught me that a family is not only the one we are born into, but the one we choose to build, sometimes out of grief, sometimes out of desperate hope, and sometimes, as in our case, out of a single act of kindness extended to a stranger on an ordinary Saturday afternoon that neither of us expected to change the entire course of our lives. Clara and I now visit her mother's grave every autumn, when the maple tree above it turns that same brilliant amber and gold that filled the dining room windows on the evening I first pretended to be her husband and became, through the slow unfolding of genuine love, exactly that. We bring flowers from the garden Margaret once tended, and we tell her, in the quiet way that grief eventually settles into gratitude, about the life we have built together, the life she gave us the courage to claim by seeing through our lie and choosing love anyway. If you have made it this far in our story, I want to ask you, before we close, to think about a moment in your own life when kindness toward a stranger changed everything, or a moment when someone chose to believe in the good in you even when the truth was more complicated than it first appeared, and I hope you will share that memory in the comments below. Because these stories of grace and second chances mean so much more when we hold them together as a community. If this story touched your heart the way it continues to touch mine every single day, please take a moment to like this video, leave a meaningful comment about the lesson it brought to your life, share it with someone who might need a reminder today that hope and love can arrive in the most unexpected disguises, and subscribe to our channel so that you never miss another story of kindness, forgiveness, and the second chances that make this life worth living. Margaret Whitfield is gone now, but the love she recognized on that very first evening, the love she believed in before either Clara or I fully understood it ourselves, remains, steady and unshaken, the truest thing either of us has ever known, and I carry her voice with me still, in every quiet morning I wake beside my wife, in every bloom that returns each spring in the garden she once tended with her own hands, reminding me that she knew, from the very beginning, exactly what she was looking at when she took my hand and told her daughter, with absolute certainty, that she had finally found me.